So we started the service with an oldie but goodie, I'm a Believer. Now here's a generational thing. If you think that I'm a Believer was done by the Monkees, you might be part of one generation. But if you grew up thinking I'm a Believer was done by Smash Mouth because it was in the movie Shrek, you might be in another generation. But we started the series with that song, I'm a Believer. Either way, it's a solid tune about kicking off this idea of loving others, specifically loving that special person. And I was looking at the chorus, and it really struck me. And I was thinking that when the chorus says this, and then I saw her face, now I'm a believer, and not a trace of doubt in my mind. I'm in love, etc., etc., etc. I couldn't help but think about my wife, about when I first saw her. My birthday is next week. I'm not asking for gifts, but it wouldn't hurt. I'm at the age when I need to ask my wife, hey, how old am I again? And she told me, and it wasn't as low as I would have liked. I won't share that little detail, but I've officially gotten to the age where documentaries and podcasts have become more interesting than music in most movies. If I had a lawn, I would yell for you people to get off of it. I'm that old. So I asked my wife a fateful question the other day, and after I asked her how old I was, I asked her, are we coming up on 20 years married? And I'm glad she wasn't home when I asked, because I'm pretty sure she would have thrown something, possibly a Siberian Husky, at me. Instead, she patiently just texted, yep. So 20 years married, 2 years dating, 22 years together, and I still remember when I first saw her face, just like the lyrics of the song. I saw her face and I was a believer. I just moved to Xenia, Ohio, that mecca of civilization, for my summer internship. The youth pastor I was working for had worked it out for me to house sit while members of the church had gone on vacation. So which meant I basically moved from house to house every week or two over the summer. I lived out of 2 duffel bags and by the kindness of strangers. It was a weird existence. So I came down on a Saturday and got into town that evening. The youth pastor met me, and over dinner he told me I would be running the summer camp meeting for the students and parents tomorrow morning. Great. Barely any warning. I had never met any of these people, and if you've known me for more than 5 minutes, you know that I'm not the upfront guy. And yes, the irony of me saying that in this situation is not lost on me. So also, I really hate not being prepared. The amount of notice my friend gave me was not great. The youth pastor was no help as I looked to prepare. He said, you've been to summer camp, tell the families what they need to hear. My pushback was, you've been to summer camp and you know these people. And he just grinned and said it'll be fine and wandered off into the Xenia night. So I went to church for the first time at this church, and I sat in this service just dreading the meeting and standing in front of strangers, having no idea what I was going to say. So the main service ended, and then it was meeting time. The youth pastor introduced me, and I got up and started talking, and the entire time I was thinking, fake it till you make it, fake it till you make it. And then she walked in. Now, it caught me off guard because she came in late. This is not so surprising after 22 years of being together. But she came in during my info meeting, and something very specific grabbed my attention. She was wearing 2 pagers. Now, I don't have time to explain to the young folks what a pager is, so just Google it. But she had 2 of them, and the only people that I knew that carried 2 pagers from my vast movie and TV knowledge were drug dealers. And then the internal monologue started. Have you ever had this happen? You're speaking in front of people, but you're having an entire conversation with yourself while you're speaking? Maybe it's just me right now. Anyways, my brain was flying with questions. Who is this drug dealer? She seems young to have a teenager. What kind of drugs is she selling? Is it profitable? Where have I moved to in this 2-pager wearing drug dealer is coming to my camp meeting? You know, stuff like that. Spoiler alert, she was not a drug dealer. She was a social worker for the county. She had 2 pagers because she had her work pager for her clients, and she had the emergency work pager for that weekend. It was her turn to cover for the other social workers who were on vacation. So she was at the meeting. She was a volunteer youth leader for the church, and she was helping with the students going to camp. Turns out she lived 7 houses down on the same street from the house that I was house sitting that week. So we would talk on my porch, and she had sympathy for this Michigan boy in a strange Ohio town. We had amazing conversations. We would walk around town, get ice cream at the UDF, which is the United Dairy Farmers gas station. It's the Wawa of Ohio. You had to be there. I wanted to see if this dating thing was doable, and so I had to climb a tree to have the conversation. I've told that story in another sermon. It was good. And our first date was a scheduling error on my part. I double booked myself because my parents came into town, but I scheduled our first date to be the Celtic Festival in Dayton. So I went on my first date with my future wife with my parents. It was adorbs. Sometime that weekend, we were visiting some local shops, and I remember sitting with my mom on the steps and telling her that this was the girl I was going to marry. When I saw her face, I knew. It only took 2 years for that to happen. Now, we all know how that story goes. It was happily ever after. We have never fought, never had an argument, never had a disagreement. It is glorious. Yep, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And I'm going to stand over here in case I get smoked. So actually, I remember distinctly one particular fight in our first year of marriage. She set down a dish in our kitchen apartment and turned to me crying, asking if we were going to make it. Marriage is hard. I told her this is our first year and we can't expect to be like the people who've been married for like 50 years. We're figuring this out, but we need to allow ourselves a learning curve. I wish I was this wise on a regular basis. Love is hard. Marriage is an amazing institution, and when we do life with someone, it often exposes us. I learned very quickly that my idea of love and loving people was selfish and surface level. I'm still learning that lesson today. Loving is hard. So we started a new series today called Love Like Jesus, and it's not a marriage series, it's not a dating or relationship series. Instead, we're talking about how we, as Christ followers, are called to love others in all the spaces we do life in. In fact, the central premise of this series comes from John chapter 13, verse 34. If you want to turn to John chapter 13, verse 34, keep your finger next. We're going to be just sticking with this verse pretty much the whole time. Jesus says this, "So now I'm giving you a new commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples." We are called to love others, really love. My marriage to Jessica has been the greatest teacher when it comes to learning what real lasting love is. There's a clear difference between I love tacos and I love my wife. One love is purely selfish and all about my wants and needs, the tacos. I want to clarify that. I really do love tacos, but is that all that love is when I say I love tacos? The bigger idea of love and loving is sacrificial, and it serves because I want the best for the other person. The big question we need to ask ourselves this week and over the coming weeks as we consider this idea of loving like Jesus is, what does that type of love require of me? Loving like Jesus requires sacrificing for the other person regardless of how it impacts me. When we typically think of loving others, we often think of this section of the Bible. Two different gospel writers record this interaction between Jesus and a teacher of the law. The teacher of the law is trying to get Jesus with a gotcha moment, a gotcha question. So check out Mark chapter 12 with me. We'll come back to John 13, so don't lose that. Mark chapter 12 and verse 28 says this: "One of the teachers of religious law was standing there listening to the debate. He realized that Jesus had answered well, so he asked of all the commandments, which is the most important?" The most important commandment is this: "Listen, O Israel, the Lord your God is one and only Lord. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and all your strength. The second is equally important: love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these." If this were today, you can imagine this religious guy with his cell phone out shouting a question at Jesus, all the while recording him so he can blast him on the internet if Jesus answers poorly. He basically tries to trip Jesus up by forcing him to come up with this off-the-cuff and spur-of-the-moment answer to this question about the 10 Commandments and the 600 plus laws. But Jesus aces the question. He sums up the 10 commandments and the law with this most important commandment is this: listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is one and only. And you must love the Lord with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. The second is equally important: love your neighbor as yourself. When people think of loving others, we often cite this verse, an idea of loving our neighbor, even if we don't know it's straight lifted from Jewish and Christian scriptures. Our culture talks about the importance of loving the neighbor. I remember hearing nonstop during the pandemic about watching out for others, not raiding and hoarding things at the grocery store, and considering the collective good rather than our own individual needs. We as a country were talking about this idea of loving our neighbors. Now, like I said, it's an amazing idea that's rooted in Jewish and Christian tradition. Jesus says that these commandments and laws can be summed up with love God with everything we have and love our neighbors because they deserve to be valued and loved. But like most things, we can be superficial and we can distort the idea to suit our wants and needs. During the pandemic, love our neighbor meant don't hog the toilet paper because I need some too. Loving my neighbor as myself became more about what I thought love meant and giving that type of love to my neighbor. And this is how I like to be loved, therefore this is what love is. Like my first year of marriage with Jess was hard. Jess had every right to cry in that kitchen that night. Those of you who have been married know that the first year or first 10 are hard. Joining two lives with all of our individual experiences and wants is not easy. In fact, our first 5 years of marriage were a roller coaster. I was serving my first youth pastor job, and the church faced a crisis that tore the church apart. It was so bad that the lead pastor and the associate pastor left, and I had no idea. I was tasked with saving the church. I was told by the people in charge that, hey, your job is to save the church. I was told that I had to do the majority of Sunday morning teaching along with all the youth group and youth activities. Somehow I got into my head, if I failed at this job, then I would never get another youth pastor job again. My entire existence was all about saving the church and saving my job. Few people were around to tell me or anyone else how unhealthy this was. My depression spiraled out of control. Really, my mental health spiraled out of control. And in the midst of that, Jess and I got married. And it was not a healthy time for me to get married. In fact, a lot of our marriage was all about keeping me sane as we tried to navigate this church crisis. The idea of loving the other like myself became all about me. I definitely attached to the idea of love serving me. I'm not going to lie, it was pretty great. But it wasn't healthy for Jess. It was all about my needs, my depression, and my idea of love. This was the heart of our marriage for years, and it's taken years to untangle it. And we're still working on it. I warped Jesus' saying of loving the other like you want to be loved and made it superficial and selfish. How often have we thought about loving the other and have really just made it about us? So let's dig back into that commandment that Jesus gave in John chapter 13, but let's give it a little context. This is the moment of the Last Supper. Jesus' disciples have gathered in the upper room, and Jesus does something unexpected. He gets down on his knees, and he begins to wash his disciples' feet. This was an ultimate example of serving the other. I know many of us aren't fans of feet today, but can you imagine how dirty the feet were back then? I mean, don't spend too much time on it. They've been walking through dusty roads with sandals on. They've done their best to avoid the road apples that horses, camels, and livestock had left on the roads. To say their feet were dirty was an understatement. And here is their master, their rabbi, getting on the floor, carefully slipping each shoe off, and gently washing their feet. It was a moment of humility, service, grace, and above all else, love. After this, Jesus chose to have a last teaching with his most trusted followers. This is the night that Jesus is betrayed and arrested. So he invites his followers, and one of the first things he teaches and emphasizes is that his followers are to be known by their love. So let me read John 13:34 again. So now I'm giving you a new commandment. Love each other. Just as I have loved you, you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. Not a self-serving love, not a superficial love. This is a love marked by Jesus' example. This is a love that requires something of the person who is choosing to love the other. And he demonstrated this idea with an object lesson. He washed the disciples' feet. This love that was demonstrated required something of Jesus. He saw the need. His disciples were considered unclean until their feet were washed. He takes action expecting nothing in return. He serves for the sake of serving. This is the love that Jesus expects the church, and he expects from each of us as individual followers. What does loving like Jesus require of me and us today? Are we willing to do it? We don't like to think about love requiring something of us. It's not very romantic. I don't think Taylor Swift has written a love song about requiring something from the other. Maybe she has. She's prolific. We all want the love where it's about the feelings and the emotion, the when I saw her face, I knew that type of love. That feeling when I saw that two-pager but not drug-dealing Jess that Sunday morning. That love was simple. It was good. But it wasn't the fullest example of love. When we were considering moving to New Jersey, Jess was really wary because church work up until this point in our lives had been a dumpster fire. It had been a battle with my own mental health, with my warped idea of what people expected of me. She knew that I wanted to get back into church work, but it was scary for her. But she was willing to love me like Jesus and step into this new thing because she was willing to do that hard love. But she told me she needed, one could say she required some things of me if we were going to move to the East Coast. She required that I take care of myself. She required that I set up and continue counseling for my mental health. She required that I do more around the house because the habit was I would overextend myself serving the people at church and then come home and just kind of cocoon myself into my own world and watch Netflix or something like that while she did all the housework. She essentially said, I want to do this for you and with you, but are you willing to do this for me? Healthy loving of someone else requires this. Was I willing to do what love required? Well, we are here in New Jersey, and despite living in smaller conditions than what we expected, I would say that we've been healthier than we've ever been. But it took Jess voicing her needs and challenging me to do what love requires to get there. She had voiced her needs before, but it was in this moment I really listened. The question for this morning is, am I willing to love like Jesus? And am I willing to do what that love requires of me? Jesus gives us a hint in what loving the other looks like when he says this in John chapter 13. Love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. And he says that phrase, just as I have loved you. When I think of the stories of Jesus from the Gospels and how he loved other people, I think of a few key things that are deeper than most of our love songs and our culture's superficial idea of what love looks like. The first thing is this: loving like Jesus requires us to see the needs of the other person. Jesus demonstrated his love for his disciples by seeing the need. The need was unclean feet, which in their culture was a big deal. He could have seen the need, pointed it out, and probably gotten one of his guys to wash everyone's feet. In fact, Peter freaks out when he realizes that Jesus is going to wash his feet. He can't let this humiliating moment happen. But Jesus calmly tells him that this is important, and Peter relents. Jesus chooses to serve his disciples in this moment. Like I said, he probably could have gotten Peter to wash the guy's feet. They would have loved it. But instead, he saw the need, and seeing the need and just telling someone else to deal with it, that would have been a superficial way of showing love. Instead, Jesus saw the need and filled it himself because he loved his disciples. What are the needs of others around us? What are the needs we see on an everyday basis that we choose to ignore? That question bothers me. This is the worst part about preaching, is like when you ask a question, then you think about it, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, this really hurts. What are the needs I see on an everyday basis that I literally choose to ignore? I think of, we live in Collingswood, and I think of this woman who I see on the street, and she has 2 shopping carts full of stuff, and I don't know how many times I've walked into Wawa and she's been there and I haven't even engaged with her. I haven't even talked to her. And there's a need there. How many times have I walked by someone in need, and in my quest to get whatever thing I need from the drugstore or from Wawa, I just move on because I've got things to do. But what would it look like for me to take 5 minutes and just acknowledge this person as human? What are the needs that we see on an everyday basis? Consider the spaces that you and I are in and what those needs are. How has God uniquely wired you and I to meet the needs in our families, with our friends, at work, and within the communities as we are out and about? How often do we see needs and just say, the next person will get it? How many needs are left unmet because we chose not to see them? Secondly, loving like Jesus requires us to want the best for the other person, regardless of how it impacts me. The reason Peter freaked out about Jesus washing his feet was because this was below Jesus' station as a teacher. Jesus was the rabbi. He was the master. He wasn't supposed to lower himself to do this humiliating job of cleaning feet. Peter's idea of love was wrapped up in image and station. Jesus was the teacher, and if Peter was the teacher, he would never lower himself to do something this humiliating. But Peter missed the point that Jesus was making. Loving the other is wanting the best for them despite how it may impact you. This is hard. I've faced this dilemma many times in my life, and I've hit or miss on it. I served at a huge church in Michigan. It was a couple thousand people every Sunday morning, and there were massive expectations that came with that job. The biggest expectation was numbers. How many students came to our weekly youth group events? How many came to the monthly events? How many students became Christians, and how many were baptized? They tracked everything. It was scary to be part of that because I stopped seeing students as people and started seeing them as numbers because my job depended on it. Well, I didn't achieve the goals they wanted from me, so I was called into HR on a Friday and I was given a choice. Sign this pre-written resignation letter and get severance, or be fired and not get severance. They gave me 5 minutes to think about it. It was horrible. So I remember signing the letter and walking out into the parking lot in the haze. I was devastated. I was hurt. I was embarrassed. I was angry. So they had a meeting with the parents that I wasn't invited to. The letter was read. They answered questions as they saw fit without me. The previous youth pastor who I replaced was found out to have been a child predator and had acted sexually inappropriate towards minors, and so he had already damaged the kids, and then I resigned suddenly, which caused more damage. The kids were hurt. The kids were angry. And there was trauma, and there was hurt, and there was rumors flying about me. After a week away, Jessica and I came back to church to show that we had nothing to hide. We were still around. We never said a word about what happened. We simply said we both decided to part ways. It was brutally hard. Loving the other is wanting the best for them despite how it impacts us personally. Jessica and I wanted the best for our high school students, and we didn't want what seemed to be another hurt to be a block between Christ and these students. And so we came back and we hung out and we were at church on a weekly basis for a month or two, just to show that this was important. So we continue to go to church, and despite how hurt we may have been feeling, we wanted the best for our students. Who are we having a hard time loving right now because we don't want the best for them? What do we need to bring to Jesus to help us to have a change of heart towards that person or that group of people? We are right now in a season where there are so many opinions and there are so many choose a side moments, and it is a tough time to love others because it seems like our instinct is to go to hate. What do we need to bring to Jesus to help us have a change of heart to love others better? Lastly, loving like Jesus requires us to sacrificially take action. This one seems fairly obvious. Love requires action. It's one thing to see the need, but it's one thing to want the best for the other despite how it may impact us, but it's a completely different thing to take it seriously and take action. Not wanting anything in return, but serving because the other person's need is evident and we are choosing to lovingly serve them. When we were considering moving to New Jersey and Jess lovingly said, "This is what I need if we're going to make this work," I could have said the words and begrudgingly done what she asked of me. But would that have been the loving the other like Jesus? No, it would have been half-hearted. Loving like Jesus requires us to put someone else above ourselves and sacrificing something for the sake of the other. How often do we choose to sacrifice for the others simply because we want to love them like Jesus? Too often I'm guilty of playing the long game for my wants and needs. If I do this, then probably in the future, they will probably do that. Sacrificially loving like Jesus means we simply see the person and what they need and take action to serve them with no hidden agenda. I would say a lot of us do this with a few people in our lives, whether it be our spouse, our kids, maybe our close friends. But notice that Jesus didn't specify our spouse, our kids, or our best friends when he said, "Love each other just as I have loved you." You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove the world that you are my disciples. He simply said, love each other. Love those you are around and come into contact with. And he gives us all the important why. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. This is the essence of the church. Showing up and showing love like Jesus to everyone we come into contact with means taking action. Are we willing to love like Jesus? Are we willing to show that love with our actions? What are the needs we can take action on this week? So I want to end today by reading how the Bible describes love. We often associate this with weddings, but really this is an everyday love we as Christ followers are supposed to have. A lot of us are familiar with 1 Corinthians 13 if we've ever been to a wedding. But 1 Corinthians 13 starts out like this: "If I could speak with all the languages of earth and angels, but didn't love others, I would only be a noisy gong or clanging cymbal. If I had the gift of prophecy and I understood all of God's secret plans and possessed all the knowledge, and if I had such a faith that I could move mountains but didn't love others, I would be nothing. If I gave everything and I have the poor and sacrificed my body, I could boast about it, but if I didn't love others, I would gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way, it's not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. It does not rejoice about the injustices, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Love never gives up, love never loses faith, is always hopeful, endures through every circumstance." This is the type of love we are called to show others in our everyday interactions, conversations, and actions. Are we willing to step out in faith this week and love like Jesus? Who is God calling us to love that's out of our comfort zone? May we all love like Jesus this week. Let's pray. God, we are challenged this week, challenged with the command from Jesus to love others because this is what the church is supposed to do. This is how people will know that the church is worthwhile, is the love that we show. God, help us to have eyes to see people that need our love, that need to be shown love. God, give us courage to take action. God, I pray specifically for those of us that are struggling with people to love, whether it be at work, in our homes, whether it be something larger in our country. God, help us to consider, what does loving like you require of me? What does that mean to me today? God, I pray that we love like Jesus this week. In your name, amen. Thank you all for coming, and we will see you next week.